statements in one way or another. They have to make certain statements, certain claims. They speak about how they adhere to the main principles of the UN Charter. They speak about the territorial integrity. They speak about the respect for sovereignty. We also agree with this. We also support this. But I would like to remind you that the UN Charter, like any document that was adopted by the entire global community, cannot be executed randomly. It's not a menu that you can pick items from. And like I said, in the UN Charter, it is enshrined, and it even concentrates upon this principle, the principle of the right of the peoples to self-determination. And since the very beginning of the UN, its member states paid attention that the principle of the sovereignty and territorial integrity and this principle of the right of the peoples for self-determination, it has to be somehow interpreted, and the process was launched where all the countries participated, which ended with the adoption of the Declaration on the Principles of Interstate Relations based on the United Nations Charter. This document has never refuted, has never cancelled since then, and there the interaction between these two principles is interpreted in the following way. Every state must adhere to the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of any other state. It represents the entire nation that lives there. It is obvious that the government does not represent the interests of the people in Crimea or in Donbass. I think everyone understands this perfectly. There is no need to delve into it any further. As for the reasons why the declaration was not adopted, and instead of this, Indian presidency will outline their vision of the discussion as some kind of a summary by the president. I have just explained it in a lot of detail in your question, why the formula, the same formula that was put into the Bali Declaration. I also touched upon this. The summit on Bali took place more than 6 months ago, and since then a lot of things have happened that show what is going on in Ukraine, including the admission of guilt, basically, of 3 signatories of the Minsk Accords. And via Ms. Merkel, via Mr. Hollande and Mr. Poroshenko, they were directly stating that they were never going to implement these accords. And the accords, I would like to remind you, concerned including the provision of unalienable rights, human rights, in particular the rights of the Russian-speaking population to speak their native language, to teach their children in Russian. All this was not just undermined, but it was banned by law. The decision the Ukrainian parliament adopted, the decrees that the Ukrainian president signed that went for the education in Russia, the media that worked in Russian in regards to the Russian literature and Russian culture, on a general level, and many other things. Today on the sidelines, I talked to my Western counterparts. I wanted to draw their attention to this, and they're looking at you without blinking, but they are not saying anything in response. The only position they have, why Russia has allowed the invasion and they all emphasized that it was unprovoked. This invasion reflects the reaction to the war that the West was preparing for many years, and that's why it was arming the Ukrainian regime. And I would like to remind you that they took power as a result of armed coup d'etat. So the Bali formula, that a thing of the last year, of the past, a lot of things became clearer, and not only to us, because we knew about it since long, but to all those who really want to investigate what's going on. Mr. Lavrov, European media published the results of a poll, and it says that the global South sees Russia as a partner and ally, which came as a surprise for the West. When do you think this strict division happened between the countries of the golden billion, so to say, and the rest? And isn't it the reason the Western leaders and diplomats are now traveling to, for example, Blinken went to the Central Asia, and Macron went to Africa, Scholz went to India? They go there to convince this country to join the sanctions, or it is a more global matter? If we speak about history, the ancestor of this golden billion is the colonial powers that were seizing the territories, conquering the territories on various continents, and they were imposing their order, their policies to exploit their natural resources, their human resources, and largely to live at their expense. And now, our Western counterparts, when more than 50 years, well, even more than that, it's been since the decolonization was over, but it's not finalized yet, it's not completed yet, because there is a resolution of the General Assembly regarding that there are still French colonies, British colonies that violate the decisions of the General Assembly, and we also continue to work. In this regard, we will try to make sure that the UN decisions are implemented. Unfortunately, the West did not drop its neo-colonial habits, its neo-colonial aspirations, everything that is being done now to subdue the global economy, to make it work for the interests of the West. It's a neo-colonial instincts, neo-colonial practices. These are sanctions. Many members of the G20, many developing countries were talking about as being harmful for the global economy, for food security, for energy security. And I'm talking about the attempts to manipulate the prices on the global markets. For example, introducing so-called price cap for oil is basically stealing someone else's natural resources, if we see it for what it is. Manipulating the rules of the global trade, including the norms and regulations that are still existing within the World Trade Organization, and many other things as well. Yes, we can see that the West is continuing with other ways under new conditions. They are still promoting their interests without considering the interests of the vast majority of other stakeholders of the global community, and the developing countries can see it for what it is. I have already touched upon this matter, the colossal, boorish, immoral pressure. Yes, some of them, when such pressure is exerted against them, they are saying certain things, or they're voting in certain manner to relieve themselves a little bit from the pressure from the United States and their allies. But almost no developing country, maybe one or two of them, made certain decisions. Almost none of them joined the sanctions against the Russian Federation, because they are perfectly aware what is going on here, what kind of game the West is playing, and they understand that it's not about Ukraine. But the thing is that our Western counterparts want to prove to them that it's still up to them to make any kind of a decision, and the threats that are now being voiced against the Chinese People's Republic. Sometimes I wonder, are they sane, these people who are posing these threats? You cannot threat to anyone, but when you threat China under current conditions, I really can't wrap my mind around it. If we speak about the manners, well, our Western counterparts have gotten really bad with this, so they are not thinking about diplomacy anymore. They are now only deal in blackmailing and threatening everyone else. The relations we have with India can be described as the privileged strategic partnership, and they're described as such in the documents that we have signed. And these are not just words. This formula reflects the special character of our relations, starting with India's independence and up until today. That's the nature of our relations, and we appreciate highly the responsible and worthy of a great power stance that India is taking globally on all the key matters of the global agenda. And today, when addressing the participants of the Foreign Minister meeting, President Modi, I think he presented balanced and responsible position of the country as the president of the G20. And in this address, he was not just speaking about some isolated individual situations, because the West is trying to divide the geopolitical picture into individual episodes. But in the address by Mr. Modi, he gave the assessment of the situation across the globe in general terms, and I completely share it. I think it has already been published, so you can familiarize yourselves with it. As for the assistance in resolving the crisis, on many occasions we have publicly stated that we have never refused to listen to serious suggestions that are made out of the sincere willingness to find a political resolution. One more time, I would like to remind you, when we are called to start negotiations, I do not remember anyone from the Western colleagues or from anyone else from any other countries talk to Ukraine to call them upon starting, to call upon them to start negotiations. And I think there is a certain sad truth about this, because Ukraine is encouraged to continue war when Ukraine was ready to be engaged in negotiations last March, and when Ukraine suggested principles on how the situation could be resolved that we have supported, and we were ready to sign an agreement based on these principles, Ukraine was slapped on their wrists. Everyone knows this. The United States, the United Kingdom, a number of other actors from the European Union, and from what I understand, they told the Kiev regime, if Russians are ready to sign an agreement on resolving the situation, it means that we need to drag it out, that we need to make them weaker to achieve the victory on the battlefield, to defeat them on the battlefield, to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia. Listen to what the foreign ministers from Germany, or what Josep Borrell said, the top diplomat from the European Union. No negotiations before Ukraine has advantage on the battlefield. So, to call upon Russia to start negotiations, which we have never refused to have if they are in earnest, I think that's not the right thing to do. And since last March, we have not seen anything in earnest. There is only military rhetoric, some belligerent decisions made in NATO, and finally, everyone seems to be forgetting, and I mean journalists as well. None of the journalists in the West and in a number of developing countries somehow does not remember that last September, Mr. Zelensky, the head of the Kiev regime, signed a decree. And this decree forbids any kind of negotiations with the Russian government. We've been explaining this like several times a day when we answer similar questions, but somehow it remains unnoticed by our colleagues from the media, from the foreign media, and they keep on asking why won't Russia agree to have negotiations. Thank you. RT Spanish.